The candles in the great dining room at Ardenmere had been lit an hour before Josephine arrived, and by the time she crossed the threshold in her gray wool gown, every face at the long table had already turned to find her. 30 people sat in the amber warmth of her father's house, at her father's table, beneath the portrait of her father that she had watched hung on that very wall when she was 7 years old. She stood in the doorway for a moment, steadying herself against the frame as one steadies oneself before stepping onto uncertain ground, and she looked for her place among them. Lady Dorothea Vane rose from the chair at the head of the table with the unhurried grace of a woman who had been queen of every room she had entered for 40 years, and she smiled at Josephine with the particular warmth one reserves for inconvenient things. "Miss Hartwell," she said, just loud enough for the nearest 12 guests to hear. "Miss Hartwell." The Duke of Wexford, seated at Lady Vane's right hand at the far end of the table, went very still. Josephine did not know then what his stillness meant. She would not know for some time. She turned and followed Mrs. Hatch through the door, and the murmur of 30 voices resumed behind her, and the candles burned on without her. What she did not yet know was that Edmund Carlyle had watched her walk away with the expression of a man who has witnessed an injustice too specific to be an accident, and had already decided that he required an explanation before the first course was cleared. 6 weeks before that evening, Sir Robert Hartwell had died in the room above the library at Ardenmere, with Josephine holding his hand and the autumn rain coming hard against the casements. He had been ill since midsummer. The illness had begun as a weakness in the chest that the physician from Ware called nothing of consequence, and by September it had become something of considerable consequence indeed. Josephine had managed the estate during those 6 weeks, had corresponded with Mr. Silas Potts in the town, had kept the household accounts and the servants' wages and the daily rhythm of the 412-acre property that her father had spent his life making solvent. She had done all of this without complaint, because complaint was a luxury she had never been able to afford, and because her father, in his more lucid hours, had told her she was equal to it. He had also told her, in the clearest hour of his last week, that Ardenmere was hers, not entailed, not encumbered, not promised to any male relation, because Sir Robert Hartwell had held the property in fee simple since his own father's death, and had never been persuaded by fashion or social pressure to tie its inheritance to a line of descent that excluded his daughter. The will was with Mr. Potts. The will was sound. Lady Vane had arrived for the funeral and had not left. She was Sir Robert's cousin by marriage, a woman of considerable county standing, a widow of the late Colonel Vane of the Hampshire Militia, and she had stepped into the management of Ardenmere's social obligations during the mourning period with the smooth efficiency of someone who had been waiting for the opportunity. Josephine had told herself, in those first weeks, that it was kindness. Lady Vane organized the condolence calls. She directed the kitchen. She received the neighbors with the correct gravity, and wore her mourning with a precision that made Josephine's own crepe look provincial. And then Lady Vane had announced the dinner. 30 guests, the whole of the county's useful society, the first social occasion at Ardenmere since Sir Robert's death. Josephine had not been consulted. She had, in fact, been handed a list of names as a courtesy, as one might hand a list to a superior housemaid who could be relied upon to know the faces. When she had ventured to observe that she expected to sit at the table with the guests, Lady Vane had looked at her with that particular expression of patient correction. "My dear," she had said, "you have been a great help with the house. But you must understand that the county will be watching very carefully, and appearances in a house without a mistress of established standing are everything." The words had fallen on Josephine like cold water. She was 24 years old. She was her father's daughter. She was, by the terms of a legal instrument held in Mr. Potts's locked cabinet in Ware, the mistress of Ardenmere in every sense the law recognized, and Lady Vane had spoken to her as though she were a competent upper servant whose feelings were a manageable inconvenience. She had not yet told Lady Vane about the will. She had been waiting for Mr. Potts to arrive and formalize the probate. That, she understood now, walking through the servants' passage with Hatch's candle casting a thin light on the stone floor, had been a mistake born of grief and the mistaken belief that rank and decency moved in the same direction. Mrs. Hatch paused at the door of the small room where the household staff took their evening meal. It was a clean room with a good fire, and at the table sat the footman, the lady's maid Lady Vane had brought with her from her own house, and a young kitchen girl who was darning a stocking and did not look up. Mrs. Hatch set Josephine's place herself, with her own hands, and her face was a study in controlled distress. "I am sorry, miss," she said very quietly. "She said you were to eat here." Josephine sat down. If you have ever stood inside a grief so specific it has its own geography, you will recognize what she felt in that room, in that chair, in the low orange warmth of her father's kitchen fire. Leave a comment if Josephine's steadiness in that moment struck you, because her steadiness was all she had, and she held it the way one holds a candle in wind. We will stay with her now. She ate the soup that was brought, and she listened to the muffled music from the drawing room above, and she did not weep. Weeping was a thing she had done in the 6 weeks of her father's illness, alone in the garden before dawn, where no one could interpret it as weakness. She had used up a considerable portion of her available weeping in those mornings, and what remained she could not spend here, not at this table, not in this particular way. It was the youngest footman, a boy named Will, who had been at Ardenmere since he was 12, who told her that the Duke's ward was crying in the upstairs corridor. "Won't come down for supper, miss, won't come for anything. The Duke's man has tried, and the nursemaid has tried, and Lady Vane won't be bothered." Will looked at the table, then at Josephine. "He's been crying since they arrived. The poor little thing." Thomas was 9 years old and had lost his mother in February, and the world he had known before. February had not been replaced by anything he could bear. Josephine knew this because she had spoken to him in the 2 days since the guests had begun arriving, in the moments when Lady Vane was occupied elsewhere and the child was standing in doorways, looking at nothing. She knew the quality of his silence because it was a silence she recognized. She took a candle from the mantel, picked up the book she had been carrying in the pocket of her gown since her father's last week, and she went upstairs by the back stair. Thomas was in the corridor outside the green bedroom, sitting on the floor with his back against the wainscoting and his knees drawn up. He was not crying now, which was almost worse. He looked at Josephine when she appeared at the top of the stairs, and he did not speak. But he did not look away. She sat on the floor beside him. The corridor was cold, and the carpet was thin in the way that corridors are always neglected in houses where the public rooms are immaculate. She opened her father's book, a collection of natural histories with illustrations of birds and their habitats that Sir Robert had acquired when Josephine was young, and she turned to a chapter about the migration of swallows across the Channel. She began to read. She read slowly, the way her father had read to her, with attention to every particular. "The swallows crossed 800 miles, she read, driven by something in their constitution that was older than any map, and they arrived at the same meadows year after year, as though the meadow had been waiting." Thomas's breathing changed. It slowed. He shifted, almost imperceptibly, so that his shoulder came against her arm. She was 3 pages further when she heard a sound at the far end of the corridor. She looked up. The Duke of Wexford stood in the doorway of the room that had been assigned to him, his coat removed, his cravat loosened, a glass he had apparently carried upstairs held loosely in one hand. He was looking at her and at Thomas, and at the open book, and his face had a quality she had not seen on it before. Not the stone-set severity of the dinner table, not the remote courtesy of the brief exchange they had managed when he arrived. Something behind that. Something that cost him to feel. He stood there for a long moment without speaking. Then he put the glass down on the corridor table, crossed the distance between them in 4 unhurried strides, and sat down on the floor on Thomas's other side. Thomas looked at him. Edmund looked at Thomas. Then Edmund looked at Josephine. "Continue," he said. And it was not a request. She continued. She read until Thomas's head dropped against Edmund's shoulder, and the child's breath went long and even. Edmund sat without moving, one hand resting on the child's back with the careful gentleness of a man who was not certain he deserved to be trusted with something so fragile. When Josephine finished the chapter, she closed the book, and the corridor was very quiet. Edmund said nothing for a time. Then, "He has not allowed anyone near him since February." "I know," she said. He looked at her. The candle between them threw its light upward, and his face was all shadow and plains, and she read nothing certain in it. Only that he was looking at her the way one looks at something one had not expected and has not yet decided what to do about. He carried Thomas to bed himself, without summoning anyone. When he came back to the corridor, Josephine was standing. "You should return to your guests, Your Grace," she said. "The guests," he said, and there was a quality to the 2 words that she could not interpret, "are well supplied." He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, "Why are you in this corridor, Miss Hartwell? You are the daughter of this house." "Lady Vane has arranged the evening as she thought best," Josephine said, because it was the truth, and because she had decided, somewhere in the hour she had spent on that floor with her father's book, that she was done softening truths. He said nothing to that. He looked at the closed door of Thomas's room, then at Josephine's face, and there was something in his expression that was almost fury, though so tightly governed that it presented as stillness. "Good night, Miss Hartwell," he said. "Good night, Your Grace." She went back down the servants' stair. She did not know that he stood in the corridor for some time after she had gone, or that he had pressed his hand flat against Thomas's door in a gesture that had no audience and no purpose except to hold something he could not name. Edmund Carlyle had been governed by a law of his own making for 4 years, a law that had its origins in a February 3 years before Thomas's February, when his wife Catherine had died in childbed while he was at the Derbyshire estate, settling a drainage matter that could have waited. He had arrived home to a house in which everything had already been decided without him, and he had understood, standing in the doorway of the room where she had died, that his absence had been a failure of the most specific and permanent kind. He had not allowed himself to matter to anyone since. The law against it was very clear inside him. Josephine, sitting in the kitchen below with a cup of tea she had not asked for, but that Will had placed at her elbow with quiet loyalty, knew none of this. She knew only that the Duke had sat on a cold floor and listened to natural history, and that his face, in the moment before he spoke, had looked like a man hearing something through a wall he had built himself. The following morning brought rain and Lady Vane, in that order. The rain came against the east windows of the library where Josephine had gone to work on the estate accounts, and Lady Vane came through the door at 10:30 with the expression of someone who has arrived at a decision and wishes the decision to be understood as courtesy. With her came a man Josephine had not seen before, He was perhaps 60 years old, red-faced, carrying the particular confidence of a man whose money had shielded him from social consequences for too long. Lady Vane introduced him as Mr. Alistair Carver, a neighbor and creditor to the late Sir Robert's household, and she arranged them all beside the fire with the smooth organization of a woman setting a stage. The debt, Lady Vane explained, with the concerned gravity of someone delivering unwelcome news for the recipient's own benefit, was £240. It was a household account from the summer of Sir Robert's illness, outstanding against the grocer and the draper and Mr. Carver himself, who had advanced the household a sum during the months when Sir Robert could not attend to correspondence. The estate, she continued, had certain obligations. Miss Hartwell, she was certain, understood the difficulty of a young woman alone managing a property with outstanding accounts. Mr. Carver had been generous enough to indicate that he might consider an arrangement. Mr. Carver smiled at Josephine with the expectant patience of a man who had been told the conclusion of the conversation in advance. Josephine kept her hand still in her lap. She looked at Lady Vane. "What kind of arrangement?" she asked, though she already knew. "A practical one," Lady Vane said. "Mr. Carver is a widower. He has a comfortable house at Whitmore. The county would think it a sensible match, given the circumstances." The rain came harder against the windows. Josephine was 24 years old, and her father had been buried 7 weeks, and the man watching her from beside the fire was not a villain in any particular way, only a man who had been told there was something available and had arrived to collect it. That made it no more bearable. "I will require a few days," she said. "Of course," said Lady Vane, and the smile widened by precisely the degree required to convey that a few days was a courtesy, not a negotiation. When they had gone, Josephine sat very still in the library and looked at the rain on the east windows. The £240. She knew the accounts as well as she knew her own name. She knew that her father, in his last weeks of clarity, had written several letters. She had not known the contents of all of them. She needed to speak to Mr. Potts. She went to find Edmund. She did not intend it to read as seeking him out. She went to the library because it was her library, and she found him there before her. Standing at the window she had been watching rain through not 20 minutes earlier, with Mr. Potts on the opposite side of the hearth. Both men turned when she entered. Edmund's expression was the careful blankness of someone who has arranged it deliberately. Mr. Potts had the expression of a man caught in a situation he had intended to manage on his own timetable. She looked at Mr. Potts. "You are here," she said. "I am, Miss Hartwell," he said. He cleared his throat. "I arrived this morning. I had intended to call upon you privately before the evening." "And His Grace?" she said. "His Grace," Mr. Potts said, with a glance at Edmund that was both dry and slightly apologetic. "Inquired whether there was a solicitor connected to the estate, and was told my name by Mrs. Hatch. He sent for me at 7 this morning." She looked at Edmund. "Mrs. Hatch," he said, "was forthcoming when I spoke to her last night." He paused. "She has been in this house for 31 years, and she did not believe she was speaking out of turn." "She was not," Josephine said. "Miss Hartwell," Mr. Potts said, and he picked up the leather document case that had been resting against the chair leg. "Sir Robert's will was authenticated at the court in Ware on the 14th of last month. The estate of Ardenmere, comprising 412 acres of Hertfordshire, the house and all appurtenances, is willed solely and without condition to Josephine Margaret Hartwell, daughter of Sir Robert Hartwell and his late wife Eleanor, to be held in fee simple as her full property." He looked at her over the case. "It is yours, Miss Hartwell, in every legal sense. Lady Vane holds no title to it. and no claim against it, and the matter of the £240 household account was settled by Sir Robert himself in a letter of credit to Mr. Carver's man of business, dated the 2nd of October. I have the receipt. The fire crackled. The rain came against the window. Josephine said nothing for a moment. She pressed her palms flat against the front of her skirt, a gesture she made when she needed to feel the ground. "Then why?" she said at last, very quietly. "Did Lady Vane seat me with the servants?" The question sat in the room without an answer, because the answer was too plain to require one. Edmund had turned back to the window. His profile was very still, and she saw, for the first time, the small muscle along his jaw that moved when he was governing something. "Tonight," he said, addressing the glass, "Lady Vane intends to announce Mr. Carver's suit before the assembled guests." "Tonight," Josephine said, and understood. "There is one course of action," Edmund said, "and it requires your consent." "Name it," she said. He turned. He looked at her with the directness of a man who has decided to stop being careful. "Come to dinner," he said. "Take your place at that table, and leave the rest to me." She might reasonably have asked what the rest consisted of. She might have said that she had managed 6 weeks of her father's dying and 7 weeks of Lady Vane's quiet occupation without anyone's assistance, and she was not certain she required it now. She might have said that the law was already on her side, and Mr. Potts was holding the proof. She said, "Very well." What she could not have told you, standing in her own library with the rain at the window and her father's solicitor holding the instrument of her inheritance, was why she trusted him. His coldness had been unmistakable. His commands dressed themselves as protection, and she had read them correctly, even while she had not known what to make of the man inside them. She trusted him, she thought, the way she had trusted the floor of the corridor the night before. Not because it had recommended itself to her, but because it was there, and it was solid, and she had decided to stand on it. The dinner that evening was already assembled when Josephine came to the top of the main stairs. She wore the better of her 2 remaining dresses, a deep blue wool that had been her best before her father's illness made any best beside the point, and she had dressed her hair simply, without the ornament she did not own. Below, in the hall, the guests were moving toward the dining room in the measured processional of the county gentry at a good table. She came down the stairs. Lady Vane, stationed at the dining room door, saw her first. The smile appeared, patient and corrective. "Miss Hartwell," she said, loud enough as always for the nearest guests to hear, "I think you will find Mrs. Hatch is expecting you below." "I believe I will find my chair at the table," Josephine said. The small silence that opened was not long, but it had a quality of attention, the way a room attends when something unexpected has been said aloud. Lady Vane's expression shifted, barely, toward something harder beneath the patience. "My dear," she said, and the endearment was precise as a blade, "you are a great help to this household, but you must understand your place within it." "I understand it very well," Josephine said. She moved past Lady Vane toward the dining room door. She was aware of the faces. 30 people, the same 30 from the night before, arranged around the same table in her father's house, and every face was turned toward the small drama at the door. She did not hurry. She walked to the table and stood at the empty chair near its center, the chair that had been no one's chair, and she did not sit down, because she was waiting. Lady Vane followed her. The room had gone quiet with the particular quality of quiet that descends when a social incident has moved beyond the recoverable, and people are deciding whether to witness it or look away. Lady Vane stopped beside her. "This young woman," she said, addressing the table as though she were delivering a judgment on behalf of the room, has been a good and useful servant to Sir Robert's household. But she is not a guest here, and I must ask her, kindly, to remember that." She looked at Josephine as she said it. Josephine did not move. Several things happened almost simultaneously after that. Mr. Potts, who had been stationed near the sideboard with the careful patience of a man who has planned his entrance, straightened. Edmund, who had been seated at Lady Vane's left and had not yet spoken, pushed his chair back from the table and stood. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He was the Duke of Wexford, and he was standing. And when a duke stands in a dining room, the room reorganizes itself around the fact. He walked the length of the table. It was not a long walk, perhaps 12 feet, perhaps 15. But he walked it as though he had all the time in the world, and not a single doubt in it. And the room watched him come. He stopped beside Josephine. He looked at her, not at Lady Vane, not at the assembled county, only at her. And she held his gaze because she was the daughter of this house, and she had stood on cold stone floors and read about migrating birds, and she was not going to look away now. Then he turned to the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "allow me to present Miss Josephine Hartwell, mistress of Arden Mere, on whose behalf we are all guests this evening." The room was still. Lady Vane made a sound. It was barely audible, a small collapse of breath, the sound of a script losing its final line. Mr. Potts moved forward from the sideboard. He opened the case. He did not read the whole of it, only the relevant passage, in the dry, precise voice of a man who has spent 30 years in the service of the law and knows where its weight falls. Sir Robert's will, the 412 acres, the fee simple title, the authenticated probate, the receipt for the settled debt of £240, paid in full in October. Miss Cecily Drummond, seated 3 chairs from Edmund's vacant place, looked once at Lady Vane and once at Josephine, and then at Edmund's profile, and something in her face shifted, a quick calculation followed by a quick, quiet acceptance. She turned her gaze to her plate. Whatever she had been told to expect this evening, she had been told it by Lady Vane, and she was not a foolish girl. Lady Vane stood with the fan half raised, and for the first time in Josephine's observation of her, she had no instruction for her face. She said, "The debt," and stopped. She said, "The will is not," and stopped again. She looked at the document case in Mr. Potts's hands, and the words left her with the quiet finality of a candle going out. "Lady Vane," Edmund said, not unkindly, and the 2 words were a door closing on a particular chapter. Old Colonel Fane, seated at the table's far end, a man who had known Sir Robert for 30 years and had watched the whole proceeding with the expression of someone who had suspected the shape of it, lifted his glass. No one had given him a signal. He did it because it seemed correct. "Miss Hartwell," he said, "mistress of Arden Mere." 3 or 4 voices joined him, then a few more. Josephine looked at the glass Colonel Fane had raised toward her, and her throat tightened with something she was not going to name in this room, in front of these people, but which had been building since October. She sat down at the table that was hers. Edmund sat beside her. The room, after a long moment, resumed the particular business of a county dinner, the silver and the candlelight, and the conversation settling back into their proper channels, though with a different current beneath them. Mrs. Hatch appeared at the sideboard door. She was not required in the dining room at this hour. She had come because she needed to see it, and Josephine saw her looking and held her gaze for a moment across the candle-lit room, and something passed between them that did not require speech. Lady Vane sat. She ate in silence with the careful precision of a woman dismantling a position she had held too long and had assumed was permanent. She would leave Arden Mere in the morning. She would not be cruel about it, because cruelty in defeat was below even her, and she had enough self-knowledge to recognize that the instrument she had used, Josephine's apparent powerlessness, had been false, and that the falseness had been her error, not her enemy's cunning. She would not forgive it of herself easily. That was visible in her face before she schooled it. A single clause in the story of her confidence. It had never failed her before. Mr. Carver, who had been introduced at the table and who had understood the situation at roughly the same moment Lady Vane had, finished his soup with the philosophical composure of a man who had come to a fair and found that the item he had been told was available had already been claimed. He was not a wicked man. He had been told a thing, and had believed it, and he was sensible enough to know when the information had been wrong. He made his excuses before the second course. Edmund said nothing to Josephine during the dinner, not directly. He attended to the table's conversation as a senior guest was required to do, and she did the same, and there was a quality to the parallel work of it, each of them managing their end of the table, each of them present in the same room as equals, that was new and slightly disorienting, like a window being opened in a house where the windows had been painted shut for a season. Once, when she reached for the salt, and their hands came within an inch of each other, and then withdrew by the unspoken instinct of people maintaining propriety, she heard him take a brief, controlled breath. She thought that breath had nothing to do with salt. Afterward, when the guests had retired and the house was quiet, she found him in the library. The fire had burned low. He was standing at her father's desk, and on the desk was the natural history book, which she had left on the corridor table the night before, and she had not thought to collect it. He had not opened it. He was simply standing beside it, with the look of a man who had been keeping company with an object, because the object was connected to something he had not yet decided how to hold. She came in and sat in the chair by the fire, and did not pretend she had come for another reason. "Thomas," she said. "He slept through the night," Edmund said. "Will said so." She looked at the fire. "He will want to hear what happens to the swallows," she said. "The next chapter describes their return." Edmund stood very still beside the desk. She could feel him deciding something, the way one feels a change in the air before weather arrives. "He has not spoken," he said. "Since February. Not a word to anyone. Not to me." She looked up at him. "He spoke to you," he said. "When you came into the corridor. He said your name." His voice was very level, but it was level the way water is level over a deep place. "He called you Miss Joe." She felt the warmth of it move through her chest, and she looked at the fire rather than at him, because the warmth was not something she had the defenses ready for. "I will tell you something," Edmund said, and he came around the desk and sat in the chair opposite hers, and the fire threw its unsteady light between them. "Catherine died in February 4 years ago, and I was in Derbyshire. I arrived home to a house that had rearranged itself around her absence, and I understood that I had been mistaken about what required my attention." He said this without inflection, as though reading a record of facts. "Thomas has been in my care since his mother's death, and I have not known how to reach him. And I have told myself it was his grief, and it was also mine. And I did not see the difference clearly until last night." Josephine said nothing. The fire spoke instead. "You sat on the floor of a cold corridor," he said, "in a house that had been taken from you, and you read to a child who was not your responsibility, and you did it as though it were the most natural thing in the world." He looked at his hands. "It was not natural. It was courage. I want you to know that I saw it." She held the warmth in her chest very carefully. "You could not have known the corridor was cold," she said. "You have only been here 2 days." The corner of his mouth moved. It was brief and unguarded, and it rearranged his whole face into something she had not seen before, and it came and went in the span of a held breath. But she had seen it. It was the first time, and it was significant, and she knew it. "Josephine," he said, and it was the first time he had used her name, and he had used it deliberately, with the full weight of knowing what it meant in this register, in this room, between two people at a fire in a house that had been, hours ago, a different house entirely. "I have a ward who has just spoken for the first time in 9 months, and an estate in Derbyshire that requires a mistress, and a very strong preference for not spending another winter being governed by a law I invented in grief." He paused. "I am not eloquent on the subject of what I am asking. I am aware of that." "You are asking," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at him across the low fire, this man who had sat on a cold floor and said continue and crossed a dining room as though he had been appointed to it, and spoken her name as though it were a declaration. And she thought of her father's house around her, the 412 acres outside in the dark, the book on the desk, the child asleep upstairs with a whole chapter still unread. She thought of the winter, and the spring that followed winters. "Ask properly," she said, "and I will answer." He looked at her, and the last of the evening's careful management left his face all at once, the way ice leaves a river, not breaking, but releasing. And in its place was something she recognized from the corridor, the expression of a man hearing something through a wall he had built himself, except that this time he had opened the door. He asked. She answered. The house settled around them in the way that houses settle when a new arrangement has been made that fits the weight of the rooms better than the old one did. It had been snowing since midnight, though neither of them had noticed until Edmund moved to the window to close it against the draught and found the garden white, the hedgerows white, the drive white all the way to the gate, and the snow still coming in long, steady lines through the lamplight. Josephine came to stand beside him and looked at her father's garden in its altered December and felt something she had not felt since the morning of the first frost in October, when she had still believed the world would be fair. She felt that she was precisely where she was supposed to be. Behind them, the library door opened, and Thomas stood on the threshold in his nightshirt, his dark hair disordered from sleep, the natural history book under his arm. He had carried it from the corridor table himself. He looked at Josephine and at Edmund and at the snow beyond the window, and something moved in his face, slow as the first greenery of spring. "Miss Jo," he said, "what happens to the swallows when they come back?" Edmund made a sound. It was very small. It was not quite a breath and not quite a word, but it was the sound of something that had been held a long time finally being set down. Josephine crossed the room to Thomas and took the book from under his arm and brought him to the chair by the fire, and he settled against her side the way he had settled in the corridor. And she opened to the chapter about the swallow's return. Edmund did not sit. He stood near the window for a moment with the snow behind him and the firelight in front of him, and his hands quiet at his sides, watching the two of them in the deep chair. And the last of the law he had made in grief was already gone. He had not noticed the exact moment it left. He moved to the arm of the chair and leaned against it, close enough that Josephine's shoulder rested against his hand. She read. The swallows, she read, arrived at the same meadows in April, every year without fail, as though the meadow had placed a specific expectation upon the air. And the birds, crossing those 800 miles of sea and sky and weather, had felt it. They returned to the nests they had left. They came back to the same corners of the same familiar eaves, and the meadow received them, and the spring was complete. Thomas was asleep before she reached the end of the page, his breath long and even, his weight warm against her side, the book open across his lap. The fire had burned to its last steady glow. The snow came on outside the long windows of Ardenmuir, falling without hurry across 412 acres of Hertfordshire dark. Edmund said her name once more, very quietly, and she answered. The house was hers. The child was sleeping. The snow was settling over the garden and the hedgerows and the long white drive, covering everything that had been difficult, not erasing it, only quieting it, the way snow quiets the ground it falls on, so that in the morning there is only the clean white surface and the knowledge of what it holds, and the absolute certainty that spring will come. If Josephine's story moved you, leave a word in the comments. She held on to the floor of her father's house by the simple act of refusing to leave it, and in the end, the house held her back.